Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely exhausted, as if someone had reached inside your chest and extracted every ounce of life force you had? Have you ever noticed that certain people seem to have this uncanny ability to leave you feeling confused, guilty, or emotionally depleted, even when the interaction seemed perfectly normal on the surface? If you have experienced this, you are not alone. Millions of people struggle with what they describe as energy vampires, toxic individuals, or draining personalities. The internet is flooded with advice about how to protect yourself from these people. Light visualization techniques, setting energetic boundaries, cutting cords, creating protective shields, and countless other methods that promise to keep negative energy at bay. But what if I told you that all of these approaches are missing the fundamental point? What if the real problem is not the other person at all, but something happening within your own unconscious mind? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, had a radically different perspective on this phenomenon. According to Jung, the experience of being drained by others is not really about their energy affecting yours. It is about unconscious psychological processes within yourself that make you vulnerable to certain types of people and interactions. Jung called this process psychic contamination. It occurs when your own unresolved psychological complexes resonate with and become entangled with those of another person. In other words, you can only be drained by someone else to the extent that they activate something that already exists within your own unconscious mind. This insight changes everything. It means that the solution is not to protect yourself from others, but to become conscious of and integrate the unconscious parts of yourself that make you vulnerable in the first place. It means that true energetic protection comes not from external techniques, but from internal psychological work. In this exploration, we will dive deep into Jung's understanding of why some people seem to drain your energy, how your own psychological blind spots create these vulnerabilities, and most importantly, how you can develop genuine immunity to emotional manipulation and psychic contamination through the process of individuation. If you have ever felt like you give more than you receive, if you find yourself constantly attracted to people who need fixing, or if you struggle with setting boundaries without feeling guilty, this analysis will reveal the unconscious patterns that keep you trapped in these dynamics. The journey we are about to take is not comfortable. Jung did not offer easy answers or quick fixes. He offered something far more valuable: the possibility of genuine psychological freedom through the courageous work of self-understanding. Most people, when they feel emotionally drained by someone, immediately conclude that the other person is the problem. They label them as toxic, narcissistic, manipulative, or energy vampires. While these labels might provide temporary relief and a sense of understanding, they also create a dangerous illusion of powerlessness. They suggest that your emotional well-being is at the mercy of other people's behavior. Jung saw through this surface-level interpretation to something much more complex and ultimately more empowering. He recognized that human beings are not separate energy systems that can drain each other like batteries. Instead, we are interconnected psychological beings whose unconscious minds are constantly communicating and influencing each other in ways we rarely understand. When you feel drained by someone, according to Jung, what is actually happening is that their psychological material is resonating with and activating your own unconscious complexes. A complex in Jungian psychology is an emotionally charged cluster of ideas or images that exists in your unconscious mind. These complexes are formed through life experiences, particularly those from childhood, and they operate autonomously, influencing your thoughts, emotions, and behavior without your conscious awareness. For example, if you have an unconscious complex around abandonment, you might find yourself particularly affected by people who are needy, demanding, or emotionally unstable. Their neediness triggers your abandonment complex, causing you to either flee in anxiety or become compulsively helpful as a way to manage your own fear of being left alone. Either way, the interaction feels draining because it activates a part of your psyche that carries unresolved emotional charge. This is why the same person who drains you completely might have little to no effect on someone else. It is not that they are objectively more sensitive or psychically gifted. It is that their psychological makeup does not contain the particular complexes that would resonate with that person's unconscious material. Understanding this principle fundamentally shifts the locus of control from external to internal. It means that your experience of being drained is information about your own psychological state, rather than evidence of the other person's toxicity. This does not mean that some people do not behave in genuinely harmful ways, but it does mean that your reaction to their behavior is determined by your own unconscious patterns. Jung observed that we are inevitably drawn to people and situations that mirror our own unintegrated psychological material. This is not conscious choice, but an unconscious compulsion driven by what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural tendency to seek wholeness through encounters with what we have disowned or rejected in ourselves. This unconscious attraction to what mirrors our shadow material explains why people often find themselves repeatedly involved with similar types of problematic individuals. The woman who keeps dating emotionally unavailable men, the man who repeatedly becomes involved with partners who betray his trust, the person who always ends up in friendships where they give much more than they receive. These patterns persist not because these individuals are unlucky or particularly susceptible to manipulation, but because their unconscious complexes are seeking resolution through these repeated encounters. The tragedy is that most people never recognize this dynamic. They focus on changing the other person, avoiding certain types, or protecting themselves energetically, never realizing that the real work lies in understanding and integrating their own unconscious material. As a result, they remain vulnerable to the same types of draining interactions throughout their lives, simply with different people playing the same archetypal roles. Jung called this unconscious psychological material the shadow, and understanding the shadow is crucial to understanding why some people seem to drain your energy while others do not. The shadow in Jung's psychology represents everything about yourself that you have rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. It contains not only your repressed negative traits like anger, selfishness, or manipulation, but also your unlived potential, your creative impulses, your authentic desires, and even positive qualities that you have been taught to hide or suppress. The shadow is not inherently negative, but it becomes problematic when it remains unconscious. When you are not aware of your shadow material, it operates autonomously, influencing your perceptions, reactions, and choices in ways that often work against your conscious intentions. One of the most important mechanisms through which the shadow operates is projection. Projection occurs when you unconsciously attribute your own disowned traits, feelings, or motivations to other people. You see in others what you cannot or will not see in yourself. This is where the experience of being energetically drained becomes particularly relevant. Often, the people who drain you the most are those who embody aspects of your shadow that you have not yet integrated. They trigger such strong reactions in you precisely because they are mirroring back parts of yourself that you have rejected. Consider the person who is constantly irritated by others, who seem selfish or self-centered. Upon closer examination, this individual often struggles with their own desires and needs, having learned early in life that wanting things for themselves was wrong or dangerous. The shadow in this case contains the natural, healthy selfishness that every person needs to function effectively in the world. When they encounter someone who expresses this quality openly, it triggers both envy and moral outrage, creating an intense emotional reaction that feels draining. Or think about someone who becomes exhausted by people they perceive as attention-seeking or dramatic. Often, this person has suppressed their own need for attention, recognition, or emotional expression. The dramatic person activates their shadow material around wanting to be seen and heard, creating an internal conflict that manifests as fatigue and irritation. The shadow also contains what Jung called the inferior function, which represents the least developed aspect of your personality. This inferior function creates a particular vulnerability to certain types of people and situations. If your dominant function is thinking, for example, your inferior function is feeling, making you particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation or becoming overwhelmed in emotionally charged situations. Understanding your shadow and inferior function is crucial because these represent the psychological entry points through which others can unconsciously influence or drain you. When these aspects of yourself remain unconscious, they create blind spots in your awareness that others can unconsciously exploit. But here's the paradox that Jung discovered. The very people who seem to drain your energy are often your greatest teachers. They are showing you, through the intensity of your reaction to them, exactly what parts of yourself need integration. The angry person shows you your disowned anger. The needy person shows you your disowned neediness. The manipulative person shows you your disowned desire to control others. This does not mean you should tolerate abusive behavior or remain in harmful relationships. It means that you can use these encounters as mirrors for self-understanding rather than simply viewing them as attacks on your energy. When you begin to reclaim and integrate your shadow material, something remarkable happens. The people who once drained you either change in your perception or naturally move out of your life. This transformation occurs because you are no longer unconsciously participating in the same psychological dynamics. You are no longer projecting your disowned material onto others, which means you are no longer hooked by their behavior in the same way. You become what Jung called differentiated, able to see clearly what belongs to you and what belongs to others. The process of shadow integration is not comfortable. It requires admitting to yourself that you possess qualities you have spent your entire life rejecting. It means acknowledging that you too are capable of selfishness, manipulation, neediness, anger, or whatever other traits you find most disturbing in others. But this acknowledgement is not a moral failing. It is a step towards psychological wholeness and genuine energetic autonomy. To understand why some interactions feel particularly draining, we need to explore Jung's concept of psychological types and the inferior function. Jung identified 4 basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition, and observed that most people develop 1 or 2 of these functions quite well while leaving others relatively undeveloped. The inferior function represents your psychological weak point, the area where you are most unconscious, most easily influenced, and most vulnerable to external manipulation. It is through this inferior function that psychic contamination most easily occurs. If you are primarily a thinking type, someone who navigates the world through logic, analysis, and rational decision-making, your inferior function is likely feeling. This means that while you excel at processing information objectively, you may struggle to navigate emotional situations with the same clarity and competence. When you encounter someone who operates primarily through emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, or dramatic expressions of feeling, they can easily overwhelm your inferior feeling function. You might find yourself agreeing to things you do not want to do, feeling guilty for setting boundaries, or becoming confused about what you actually feel versus what you think you should feel. The interaction feels draining because your psychic energy is being pulled into an area where you lack skill and consciousness, like being forced to write with your non-dominant hand for hours at a time. Conversely, if you are primarily a feeling type, someone who makes decisions based on values and emotional considerations, your inferior function is likely thinking. You might find yourself particularly vulnerable to people who use logical arguments to justify unreasonable requests, who confuse you with complex reasoning, or who make you doubt your intuitive sense that something is wrong. Your energy gets drained trying to process their arguments through your underdeveloped thinking function, while simultaneously managing the emotional impact of the interaction. Sensing types, who are primarily oriented toward concrete, practical reality, often have intuition as their inferior function. They may find themselves drained by people who operate in abstract possibilities, who make vague promises about the future, or who seem to live in a world of potential rather than actuality. The sensing type struggles to pin down these individuals to concrete commitments or practical plans, leading to frustration and energy depletion. Intuitive types, who naturally perceive patterns and possibilities, often have sensing as their inferior function. They may find themselves drained by people who focus exclusively on immediate practical concerns, who seem to lack vision or imagination, or who get bogged down in mundane details. The intuitive person's energy gets scattered trying to attend to practical matters they find boring or irrelevant. Understanding your inferior function is crucial for developing genuine energetic protection. Most people try to avoid situations that challenge their inferior function, but Jung suggested the opposite approach. He believed that developing and integrating your inferior function is essential for psychological wholeness and genuine autonomy. This development requires conscious effort and patience. It means deliberately engaging with the aspects of life and types of people that trigger your inferior function, but with awareness rather than unconscious reactivity. For the thinking type, This might mean learning to identify and express feelings without immediately analyzing them. For the feeling type, it might mean developing clearer logical thinking without abandoning their values. The process is often uncomfortable because the inferior function operates in a more primitive, less sophisticated way than your dominant functions. A thinking type's feelings might initially seem childish or overwhelming. A feeling type's logical thinking might seem rigid or harsh. But as you develop these capacities with patience and compassion, they become integrated into your overall personality, closing the gaps through which manipulation and energy drainage can occur. Jung referred to this developmental process as individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-expression. Individuation requires not only integrating your shadow and developing your inferior function, but also differentiating yourself from the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns and expectations that influence everyone in a culture. Many people who struggle with energy drainage are overly identified with collective roles and expectations. They have learned to be the helper, the nice person, the one who never says no, the peacemaker, or the strong one who handles everything. These roles are not necessarily problematic, but when they become unconscious identifications, they create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. The process of individuation involves gradually separating your authentic self from these collective roles and expectations. It means learning to act from your own center rather than from the need to fulfill others' expectations or maintain a particular image. This differentiation naturally reduces your vulnerability to energy drainage because you are no longer unconsciously seeking validation or approval through your interactions with others. One of the most powerful concepts Jung introduced for understanding interpersonal dynamics is projection. Projection occurs when you unconsciously attribute your own psychological contents, thoughts, feelings, motivations, or characteristics to another person. You see in them what actually exists within yourself but remains unconscious. Projection is a natural and unavoidable psychological mechanism. Everyone projects constantly throughout their daily interactions. The problem arises not from projection itself, but from remaining unconscious of the process. When you are unaware that you are projecting, you believe that what you see in the other person is entirely their reality, rather than partly your own psychological material. This unconscious projection creates several problems that contribute to feeling energetically drained. First, it prevents you from seeing the other person clearly, which makes it difficult to respond appropriately to their actual behavior rather than your projected interpretations. Second, it keeps you emotionally entangled with your own disowned psychological material, creating internal conflict and energy expenditure. Third, it often leads to attempts to change or fix the other person, which is both impossible and exhausting. Consider someone who consistently finds themselves drained by people they perceive as lazy or unmotivated. Upon deeper exploration, this person often discovers that they have rejected their own natural rhythms and need for rest, pushing themselves constantly and judging any desire to slow down as weakness. The projection of laziness onto others serves as a defense against acknowledging their own exhaustion and need for balance. The energy drain occurs because they are constantly fighting an internal battle. Part of them desperately needs rest and rejuvenation, while another part judges this need as laziness and pushes for more productivity. When they encounter someone who seems to embody the rest and ease they have denied themselves, it triggers this internal conflict intensely. They become drained not by the other person's energy, but by their own internal struggle with projected material. Or consider someone who feels consistently drained by people they view as selfish or self-centered. Often, this person has learned that their own needs and desires are somehow wrong or unimportant. They have developed a pattern of always putting others first, never asking for what they want, and feeling guilty when they do prioritize themselves. The shadow in this case contains healthy selfishness, the natural and necessary ability to consider one's own needs and wants as valid and important. When they encounter someone who seems comfortable prioritizing their own needs, it triggers both envy and moral outrage. The envy arises from a deep longing to have the same freedom to put themselves first, while the outrage serves as a defense against acknowledging this longing. The interaction feels draining because it activates this intense internal conflict between their authentic desires and their learned patterns of self-denial. The key to working with projection is learning to withdraw it consciously. This involves recognizing when your emotional reactions to others are disproportionately intense and asking yourself what aspect of your own psychology might be involved. The intensity of your reaction is usually a reliable indicator that projection is occurring. Jung developed a simple but powerful technique for working with projections. When you find yourself having a strong emotional reaction to someone else's behavior, try completing this sentence, "The thing that bothers me most about this person is," and then ask yourself, in what way might this quality also exist within me? This inquiry is not about self-blame or judgment. It is about reclaiming your own psychological energy by recognizing and integrating your projected material. When you can acknowledge that you too are capable of laziness, selfishness, manipulation, neediness, or whatever quality you find disturbing in others, something remarkable happens. The other person's behavior loses much of its power to trigger you. This does not mean you have to like or approve of all behaviors. You can still choose not to spend time with people whose actions you find harmful or incompatible with your values. But you can make these choices from clarity rather than emotional reactivity, which preserves your energy and allows for more conscious decision-making. Projection withdrawal also allows you to see the other person more clearly, which often reveals that they are not actually as problematic as they initially seemed. Sometimes what appeared to be manipulation was actually just awkward communication. What seemed like selfishness might have been healthy boundary setting. What looked like laziness could have been appropriate self-care. The process of recognizing and withdrawing projections is ongoing work that requires patience and self-compassion. You will continue to project throughout your life, but as you become more conscious of the process, you can catch it more quickly and work with it more skillfully. This developing awareness naturally reduces your vulnerability to feeling energetically drained because you are no longer unconsciously entangled with others through your projected material. As you become more skilled at recognizing your projections and integrating your shadow material, you may notice that certain people simply disappear from your life. This is not because you have pushed them away or protected yourself energetically, but because you are no longer participating in the unconscious psychological dynamics that maintained those relationships. Jung observed that unconscious psychological patterns create what he called constellations, recurring relationship dynamics that repeat throughout a person's life until the underlying psychological material is integrated. Someone might repeatedly attract critical partners if they have unresolved issues with authority figures from their childhood. Another person might consistently find themselves in relationships where they feel responsible for others' emotions if they learned early in life that love required them to be emotionally attuned to others' needs. These constellations persist as long as the unconscious material remains unintegrated. The person continues to unconsciously seek out the same types of relationships, often without realizing the pattern. They might change partners, friends, or even careers, but find themselves dealing with similar interpersonal dynamics wherever they go. The transformative aspect of Jung's approach is that as you integrate your shadow material and develop your inferior functions, these constellations naturally dissolve. You no longer unconsciously attract or participate in the same problematic dynamics because you have addressed the internal psychological patterns that were creating them. This transformation often happens gradually and subtly. You might notice that the drama-prone friend starts calling less frequently. The demanding family member begins to respect your boundaries without you having to constantly reinforce them. The manipulative colleague seems to lose interest in trying to involve you in their schemes. New people who enter your life tend to be more emotionally mature and respectful of your autonomy. This shift occurs because you are no longer emitting the unconscious psychological signals that attract certain types of people or interactions. When you are no longer unconsciously seeking validation, you do not attract people who offer conditional approval in exchange for compliance. When you have integrated your own capacity for healthy selfishness, you do not attract people who will exploit your tendency towards self-sacrifice. Jung described this state as psychological differentiation. You become able to clearly distinguish between your own psychological material and that of others. You can be empathetic and compassionate without becoming emotionally enmeshed. You can offer support and assistance without losing yourself in others' problems. You can maintain intimate relationships without sacrificing your autonomy. This differentiation also allows you to respond to others from choice rather than compulsion. When someone makes an emotional demand on you, you can choose whether or not to respond based on your own values and circumstances rather than feeling automatically obligated to help. This conscious choice-making preserves your energy and allows you to be genuinely helpful when you do choose to engage. The development of psychological differentiation is not a destination but an ongoing process. There will always be new situations and relationships that challenge your boundaries and reveal areas where further integration is needed. But as you develop greater self-awareness and psychological wholeness, these challenges become opportunities for growth rather than sources of drain and depletion. Jung emphasized that true psychological protection comes not from avoiding difficult people or situations, but from developing the internal resources to navigate them consciously. When you understand your own psychological patterns, recognize your projections, and maintain contact with your shadow material, you become genuinely immune to manipulation and energy drainage. This immunity is not the result of hardening yourself or becoming emotionally detached. Rather, it emerges from psychological flexibility and wholeness. You can be open and vulnerable when appropriate, while also maintaining clear boundaries. You can be compassionate and supportive without losing yourself in others' problems. You can engage fully in relationships while remaining centered in your own authentic self. The journey toward this psychological wholeness requires what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. This refers to the conscious effort required to override your natural psychological tendencies toward unconsciousness, projection, and automatic reactivity. It is natural for the psyche to operate on autopilot, to project unwanted material onto others, and to seek the familiar even when it is problematic. The opus contra naturam involves deliberately choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over projection, and authentic response over automatic reactivity. This work requires consistent effort and often involves temporary discomfort as you challenge long-established patterns. For someone who has always been the helper or rescuer, the opus contra naturam might involve learning to say no without guilt, even when others express disappointment, or try to make them feel responsible for others' emotions. For someone who avoids conflict at all costs, it might mean learning to express disagreement or set boundaries even when it creates temporary tension in relationships. This conscious work gradually builds what Jung called psychological solidity, an internal foundation that cannot be shaken by others' emotional states or manipulative tactics. You develop the capacity to remain centered in yourself while still being open and responsive to others. You can empathize without merging, support without rescuing, and love without losing yourself. The development of psychological solidity also involves cultivating what Jung called religious attitude, though this has nothing to do with conventional religion. Jung's religious attitude refers to a deep respect for the unconscious and the individuation process, recognizing that psychological development requires patience, humility, and surrender to processes that cannot be rushed or controlled. This attitude helps prevent the ego from trying to force psychological growth or attempting to achieve invulnerability through willpower alone. True protection from energy drainage comes not from ego strength, but from psychological wholeness, which develops naturally when you maintain the proper attitude toward your own unconscious processes. Developing immunity to energy drainage requires practical daily practices that support psychological integration and differentiation. These practices are not quick fixes or energy protection techniques, but sustainable approaches to building psychological wholeness over time. One of the most important practices is regular self-reflection and examination of your emotional reactions. When you notice yourself feeling drained, irritated, or emotionally triggered by someone, take time to explore what might be happening internally. Ask yourself what aspect of your own psychology might be involved in creating such a strong reaction. Keep a journal of your interpersonal interactions, noting patterns in the types of people and situations that affect you most strongly. Look for recurring themes that might indicate shadow material or projections that need integration. Notice whether you tend to be triggered by aggressive people, needy people, critical people, or any other particular type, as this often reveals your own disowned psychological material. Practice conscious feeling and emotional awareness. Many people who struggle with energy drainage have learned to disconnect from their emotions as a protective mechanism. However, this disconnection actually makes you more vulnerable because you cannot make conscious choices about emotional situations when you are not aware of what you are feeling. Learn to identify and name your emotions as they arise throughout the day. Notice the difference between emotions that belong to you and those that seem to come from others. Practice sitting with uncomfortable emotions without immediately trying to fix, change, or avoid them. This emotional awareness builds the psychological muscle needed to maintain your center in challenging interactions. Develop your inferior function through conscious practice. If you are primarily a thinking type, spend time each day checking in with your feelings and expressing them appropriately. If you are primarily a feeling type, practice logical analysis and critical thinking skills. If you are primarily a sensing type, engage with abstract ideas and future possibilities. If you are primarily an intuitive type, focus on concrete, practical matters. This development should be approached gradually and with patience. The inferior function operates in a more primitive way than your dominant functions, so expect initial efforts to feel awkward or uncomfortable. Over time, however, developing these capacities creates greater psychological balance and reduces vulnerabilities to manipulation. Practice projection withdrawal regularly. When you find yourself having strong judgments or reactions to others, take responsibility for your own psychological material. This does not mean accepting blame for others' behavior, but recognizing what aspects of the interaction belong to your own unconscious patterns. Try the practice of finding the quality you dislike in others within yourself. If someone's selfishness bothers you, explore ways in which you might need to be more appropriately selfish. If someone's neediness irritates you, consider whether you have unmet needs that you are not acknowledging. This practice helps reclaim projected energy and reduces the power others have to trigger you emotionally. Cultivate solitude and self-sufficiency. Many people who struggle with energy drainage have difficulty being alone because they have learned to regulate their emotions through relationships with others. Learning to enjoy and nourish yourself through solitude builds psychological independence and reduces the unconscious neediness that attracts draining relationships. Spend regular time alone without distractions, entertainment, or tasks. Practice being present with yourself without needing to be productive or entertained. Notice any discomfort that arises and explore what it might reveal about your relationship with yourself. Developing a positive relationship with solitude naturally reduces your vulnerability to manipulation and emotional exploitation. Work with your dreams and unconscious material. Jung believed that dreams provide valuable information about unconscious patterns and psychological development. Keep a dream journal and spend time reflecting on the images and symbols that appear in your dreams. Notice recurring characters or themes that might represent aspects of your personality or psychological development. You do not need to be an expert in dream interpretation to benefit from this practice. Simply maintaining attention to your dreams and reflecting on their possible meanings helps develop a stronger relationship with your unconscious, which supports overall psychological integration. Practice conscious boundary setting without guilt or over-explanation. Many people who feel drained by others struggle with setting appropriate boundaries because they fear conflict or disappointing others. Learning to say no clearly and kindly without elaborate justifications builds psychological strength and reduces vulnerability to manipulation. Start with small, low-stakes situations where you can practice setting boundaries. Notice any guilt, anxiety, or compulsion to over-explain that arises, and work with these feelings consciously rather than automatically giving in to them. Over time, boundary setting becomes more natural and less emotionally charged. Develop what Jung called active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with unconscious material through creative expression. This might involve writing, drawing, painting, dancing, or any other creative activity that allows unconscious content to emerge into consciousness. Active imagination helps integrate shadow material and provides insight into your own psychological patterns. The key to active imagination is approaching it without predetermined goals or expectations. Allow whatever wants to emerge to come forth, even if it seems strange or uncomfortable. This practice builds familiarity with your own unconscious processes and reduces the likelihood that they will be projected onto others. These practices work together to build psychological wholeness and genuine immunity to energy drainage. They require consistency and patience, but they offer something that no external protection technique can provide: authentic psychological freedom and the ability to remain centered in yourself while still being open to genuine intimacy and connection with others. As you develop these capacities, you may notice that your entire approach to relationships begins to change. You become less attracted to dramatic or problematic people and more drawn to those who are doing their own psychological work. Your relationships become more balanced, authentic, and nourishing because you are no longer unconsciously seeking completion through others or trying to fix their psychological problems. The ultimate goal of this work is not to become invulnerable or emotionally detached, but to develop what Jung called conscious suffering. This means being able to feel deeply and remain open to life's difficulties while maintaining clear boundaries between yourself and others. You can empathize with someone's pain without taking it on as your own. You can offer support without becoming responsible for others' emotional states. This conscious suffering is actually less painful than unconscious psychological entanglement because you are no longer fighting internal battles with projected material. You can respond to life's challenges from a place of centeredness rather than reactivity, which preserves your energy and allows for more effective action. Jung understood that the journey towards psychological wholeness is not easy or comfortable. It requires facing aspects of yourself that you would prefer to ignore and taking responsibility for your own psychological patterns rather than blaming others for your emotional experiences. But he also recognized that this journey offers the only genuine path to freedom from the unconscious patterns that keep us trapped in unsatisfying relationships and depleting interactions. The promise of this approach is not that you will never encounter difficult people or challenging situations, but that you will meet them from a place of psychological strength and clarity. You will no longer be at the mercy of others' emotional states or manipulative tactics because you will have developed the internal resources to remain centered in yourself while still being compassionate and responsive to others. When you reach this level of psychological development, something remarkable happens. The people who once seemed to drain your energy either transform in your perception or naturally move out of your life. New people who enter your life tend to be more emotionally mature and capable of genuine reciprocity. Your relationships become sources of nourishment rather than depletion, because you are no longer unconsciously seeking what you lack within yourself through others. This transformation is not the result of building walls or protecting yourself energetically, but of becoming whole enough that you no longer have the psychological gaps through which manipulation and energy drainage can occur. You become what Jung called individuated, fully yourself, while still connected to others in authentic and meaningful ways. The journey toward psychological wholeness and immunity to energy drainage is ultimately a journey toward authentic selfhood. It requires courage to face your shadow, patience to develop your inferior functions, and commitment to conscious growth over unconscious patterns. But it offers something invaluable: the freedom to be genuinely yourself while still maintaining loving connections with others. Jung's approach to human psychology recognizes that we are all interconnected, that our unconscious patterns influence each other in complex ways, and that true healing occurs not through isolation, but through conscious relationship. When you do your own psychological work, you not only free yourself from draining interactions, but also contribute to the psychological health of everyone around you. As you become more conscious and integrated, you naturally inspire others to do their own psychological work. You model what it looks like to be authentic, boundaried, and emotionally mature. You create space for others to show up more authentically, because you are no longer unconsciously inviting them to play out projected roles. This ripple effect extends far beyond your immediate relationships. Jung believed that individual psychological development contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. Each person who does the difficult work of integration and individuation helps shift the overall psychological climate toward greater consciousness and maturity. The path Jung outlined is not quick or easy, but it is profoundly transformative. It offers not just relief from energy drainage, but a complete restructuring of how you relate to yourself and others. It promises not invulnerability, but genuine strength, not isolation, but authentic intimacy, not protection from life's difficulties, but the psychological resources to meet them consciously and skillfully. If you are ready to stop seeing yourself as a victim of others' toxic energy and start taking responsibility for your own psychological development, Jung's approach offers a time-tested path toward genuine freedom. It requires commitment, patience, and courage, but it delivers something far more valuable than any quick fix: the unshakable peace that comes from knowing yourself completely and living authentically from that knowledge. The journey begins with a single step: the willingness to look within and ask not what others are doing to you, but what unconscious patterns within yourself are creating your experience of the world. This question opens the door to the most important work you will ever do: the work of becoming whole. Yet there is another layer to Jung's understanding of energetic drainage that we must explore. Beyond individual psychological complexes and shadow projections lies what Jung called the collective unconscious, a deeper stratum of the psyche that contains universal patterns and archetypal images shared by all humanity. This collective dimension plays a crucial role in understanding why certain types of relationships feel particularly draining, and why some people seem to carry an almost magnetic power to disrupt others' emotional equilibrium. The collective unconscious operates through what Jung termed archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that exist in the psyche of every individual. These archetypes include the mother, the father, the hero, the wise old man, the anima and animus, and many others. When we encounter people in our lives, we often unconsciously project these archetypal patterns onto them, seeing them not as they actually are, but as carriers of these universal images. This archetypal projection can create particularly intense forms of energetic drainage because archetypes carry enormous psychological energy. When you project the mother archetype onto someone, for instance, you unconsciously expect them to be nurturing, protective, and self-sacrificing. If they fail to live up to this projection, or if they manipulate your projection for their own needs, the disappointment and confusion can be devastating. Consider the common dynamic where someone repeatedly attracts partners who initially seem caring and nurturing, but eventually become controlling or manipulative. What often happens is that the person is projecting the positive mother archetype onto these partners, unconsciously seeking the perfect nurturing they may have missed in childhood. The partners, sensing this projection, initially play into it to establish the relationship, but eventually their own psychological needs and limitations emerge, creating conflict and disappointment. The energy drain in this dynamic comes not just from the partner's behavior, but from the constant psychological work required to maintain the archetypal projection in the face of contradictory evidence. Part of the person's psyche keeps trying to force the partner into the mother role, while another part recognizes that they are not actually fulfilling this function. This internal splitting creates enormous psychological tension and energy expenditure. Jung observed that archetypal projections are particularly common in romantic relationships, where the anima and animus archetypes are frequently activated. The anima represents the feminine aspect within the male psyche, while the animus represents the masculine aspect within the female psyche. When these archetypal images are projected onto romantic partners, they can create intense attraction, but also profound vulnerability to manipulation and energy drainage. A man who has not integrated his anima might project this archetype onto women he finds attractive, seeing them as embodying all the feminine qualities he has not developed within himself. This projection makes him vulnerable to women who can sense and manipulate his archetypal expectations. Similarly, a woman who has not integrated her animus might project masculine authority and strength onto men, making her vulnerable to those who can play into these projections while actually being weak or irresponsible. The intensity of archetypal projection explains why some relationships feel so draining even when the other person's actual behavior might not seem particularly problematic to outside observers. The drainage comes from the enormous psychological energy required to maintain projections that are not based in reality, combined with the internal conflict created when reality repeatedly contradicts the archetypal expectations. Working with archetypal projections requires a deeper level of psychological work than dealing with personal shadow material. It involves recognizing these universal patterns within yourself and learning to relate to them internally rather than seeking them in others. This process, which Jung called the integration of the anima or animus, is a crucial step in developing genuine psychological independence. For a man, integrating the anima means developing his own capacity for emotional sensitivity, intuition, receptivity, and nurturing care. As he develops these qualities within himself, he becomes less likely to project them onto women and more able to relate to women as real individuals rather than carriers of archetypal images. This integration naturally reduces his vulnerability to manipulation by women who might exploit his anima projections. For a woman, integrating the animus means developing her own capacity for logical thinking, assertiveness, leadership, and independent action. As she develops these qualities within herself, she becomes less likely to project them onto men and more able to relate to men as real individuals rather than carriers of archetypal expectations. This integration reduces her vulnerability to men who might exploit her animus projections. The process of archetypal integration is complex and often takes years or decades to accomplish fully. It requires not only psychological work, but also practical experience in developing the qualities represented by these archetypes. A man learning to integrate his anima needs to practice emotional expression, creative activities, and nurturing behaviors. A woman learning to integrate her animus needs to practice logical decision-making, assertive communication, and independent action. Jung emphasized that this integration work cannot be done purely through intellectual understanding or therapy alone. It requires lived experience, practical application, and often significant life challenges that force you to develop previously undeveloped aspects of your personality. The mother who must become both nurturer and provider for her children learns to integrate both anima and animus qualities. The man who must care for an aging parent develops his anima through practical caregiving experience. Another crucial concept in Jung's understanding of energetic drainage is what he called participation mystique, a psychological state where the boundaries between self and other become blurred or dissolved. This term, borrowed from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl's studies of primitive consciousness, describes a condition where individuals become psychologically fused with others to such a degree that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences from those of the other person. Participation mystique is the psychological foundation underlying many experiences of energetic drainage. When you are in this state with someone, their emotions become your emotions, their problems become your problems, their psychological material becomes indistinguishable from your own. This fusion creates a direct pipeline through which their unresolved psychological conflicts can flood your consciousness, creating the experience of being drained or overwhelmed. This condition is particularly common in family relationships, where psychological boundaries may have never been properly established, and in relationships with individuals who have certain personality disorders that make them unable to maintain clear psychological boundaries with others. People who struggle with narcissistic tendencies, for instance, often unconsciously induce participation mystique in others as a way of regulating their own unstable sense of self. The experience of participation mystique can be subtle and difficult to recognize because it feels like empathy or deep connection. You might believe you are simply being compassionate when you take on someone else's emotional state, or that you are being a good friend by becoming deeply involved in their problems. However, true empathy involves understanding and caring about another person's experience while maintaining your own psychological boundaries. Participation mystique, by contrast, involves losing those boundaries entirely. One of the clearest signs of participation mystique is the inability to separate your own emotional state from that of others. You might find that your mood shifts dramatically depending on who you spend time with, or that you carry other people's problems with you long after interactions have ended. You might discover that you know intimate details about others' psychological states that they have never explicitly shared with you, or that you feel responsible for managing others' emotions and reactions. Breaking free from participation mystique requires developing what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish clearly between your own psychological material and that of others. This differentiation is not the same as emotional detachment or lack of empathy. Rather, it involves maintaining your own psychological center while still being able to understand and care about others. Developing psychological differentiation requires consistent practice in identifying your own thoughts, feelings, and reactions as distinct from those of others. This might involve regularly checking in with yourself during and after interactions to notice what belongs to you and what you might have absorbed from others. It requires learning to tolerate the discomfort of others' emotional states without automatically trying to fix or change them. Many people who struggle with energetic drainage have difficulty with psychological differentiation because they learned early in life that maintaining boundaries meant being cold, uncaring, or selfish. They may have grown up in families where enmeshment was mistaken for love, where individual autonomy was discouraged, or where they were expected to be emotionally attuned to others' needs at the expense of their own development. Healing from participation mystique often involves grieving the loss of what felt like special connection or understanding with others. When you begin to maintain clearer boundaries, relationships that were based on psychological fusion may feel less intense or meaningful. You might worry that you are becoming less compassionate or that others will find you less interesting or valuable. However, what you discover through this process is that genuine intimacy actually requires psychological differentiation. When you can maintain your own center while being present with others, your relationships become more authentic and sustainable. You can offer real support and understanding because you are not lost in others' psychological material. You can love others more freely because your love is not contaminated by your own unmet needs or unconscious projections. The development of psychological differentiation also allows you to recognize and work more effectively with what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism through which opposing forces within the psyche can be integrated into a higher synthesis. When you are caught in participation mystique with someone, your transcendent function cannot operate effectively because you are not clearly aware of your own psychological position in relation to theirs. The transcendent function operates through the tension between conscious and unconscious contents, between different aspects of your personality, and between your individual needs and your relationships with others. This function is crucial for psychological development because it allows you to move beyond either-or thinking into both and integration. Instead of choosing between being compassionate or maintaining boundaries, the transcendent function helps you find ways to be both compassionate and boundaried. However, the transcendent function can only operate when you have sufficient psychological differentiation to recognize the different elements that need to be integrated. If you are psychologically fused with someone else, You cannot engage your own transcendent function effectively because you do not have clear access to your own psychological material. Jung observed that the transcendent function often manifests through creative expression, dreams, active imagination, and other activities that allow unconscious material to emerge into consciousness in symbolic form. People who are caught in draining relationships often find that their creative expression becomes blocked, or that their dreams become confused and fragmented. This happens because their psychological energy is being used to maintain fusion with others, rather than being available for their own creative and developmental processes. Reclaiming your creative expression is therefore both a sign of and a method for developing greater psychological independence. As you begin to differentiate more clearly from others, you often find that creative ideas, artistic impulses, and innovative solutions begin to flow more freely. This creative energy can then be channeled into developing greater self-understanding and more conscious ways of relating to others. The relationship between creativity and psychological differentiation reveals another important aspect of Jung's understanding of energetic drainage. Many people who struggle with being drained by others are highly creative and intuitive individuals who have learned to use these gifts in service of others rather than for their own development. They might be excellent at understanding others' psychological states, at offering creative solutions to others' problems, or at providing artistic or emotional inspiration to those around them. While these abilities can be valuable gifts to offer others, they become problematic when they are used compulsively or when they prevent you from developing your own creative potential. The person who is always helping others solve their problems never develops their own problem-solving abilities. The individual who is constantly providing emotional support to others never learns to support themselves emotionally. Jung believed that every person has a unique creative contribution to make to the world, what he sometimes referred to as their individual myth or personal destiny. Discovering and living this unique path is a central aspect of the individuation process. However, people who are caught in patterns of energetic drainage often lose touch with their own creative mission because they are too busy serving others' psychological needs. Reclaiming your creative energy requires not only setting boundaries with draining relationships, but also actively cultivating your own creative expression and following your own interests and inspirations. This might mean pursuing artistic activities that you've always wanted to try, developing skills that interest you, or simply spending time exploring your own thoughts and ideas without immediately trying to share them with or use them for others. As you develop your own creative expression, you often find that your relationships naturally become more balanced. Instead of being valued primarily for what you can provide to others, you begin to attract people who appreciate your unique gifts and perspectives. Your interactions become more reciprocal because you have your own creative energy to share rather than simply absorbing and processing others' psychological material. The cultivation of creative expression also provides a healthy outlet for the psychological energy that might otherwise be absorbed from others. When you have active creative projects and interests, your psychological energy has a natural direction and focus that makes you less available to be pulled into others' dramas and problems. You become less susceptible to energetic drainage because your energy is already engaged in meaningful activities that nourish your own development. Jung also recognized the important role that synchronicity plays in the process of psychological development and the resolution of draining relationship patterns. Synchronicity, which Jung defined as meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by cause and effect, often provides guidance and confirmation during periods of significant psychological change. As you begin to differentiate from draining relationships and develop greater psychological independence, you might notice an increase in synchronistic experiences. Meaningful books might come into your life at just the right time. Helpful people might appear when you need guidance or opportunities for growth, and healing might present themselves in unexpected ways. Jung viewed these experiences as signs that you are aligned with your own individuation process and that your psychological development is being supported by deeper patterns of meaning and purpose. However, Jung also warned against becoming overly dependent on synchronistic experiences or using them as a way to avoid taking responsibility for your own psychological work. Synchronicity can provide guidance and encouragement, but it cannot substitute for the consistent effort required to integrate shadow material, develop inferior functions, and maintain psychological differentiation from others. The ultimate goal of working with Jung's understanding of energetic drainage is not to become isolated or invulnerable, but to develop what he called conscious relationship. Conscious relationship involves being fully present with others while maintaining clear awareness of your own psychological boundaries and processes. It means being able to love and care for others without losing yourself in their psychological material. Conscious relationship requires ongoing attention and effort because the tendency toward unconscious fusion and projection is a natural aspect of human psychology. Even people who have done significant psychological work will occasionally find themselves caught in projections or participation mystique with others. The difference is that they recognize these states more quickly and have the tools to extricate themselves before becoming deeply drained or entangled. The development of conscious relationship also involves learning to recognize and appreciate the psychological work that others are doing or not doing. You become more skillful at identifying people who are committed to their own growth and development versus those who are seeking others to carry their psychological burdens. This discernment allows you to invest your relational energy more wisely, choosing to develop deeper connections with those who can engage in mutual psychological growth. Jung emphasized that conscious relationship is not about finding perfect people or avoiding all difficult interactions. Every relationship will involve some degree of projection, trigger some shadow material, and present opportunities for psychological growth. The difference is that in conscious relationship, these challenges become opportunities for greater understanding and development, rather than sources of depletion and confusion. As you develop the capacity for conscious relationship, you might find that your social circle naturally shifts. Some people who were drawn to your previous availability for psychological fusion may lose interest when you begin maintaining clearer boundaries. Others who were perhaps intimidated by your previous enmeshment patterns may become more interested in deeper connection when you demonstrate that to be both intimate and autonomous. This natural selection process can be temporarily isolating, but it ultimately leads to relationships that are more nourishing and sustainable. You begin to attract and maintain connections with people who appreciate both your individual uniqueness and your capacity for genuine intimacy. These relationships support, rather than drain, your psychological development, creating positive feedback loops that enhance everyone's growth. The journey towards psychological wholeness and immunity to energetic drainage is ultimately a journey toward authentic selfhood and conscious relationship. It requires courage to face your shadow, patience to develop your inferior functions, commitment to withdrawing projections, and dedication to maintaining psychological differentiation while still remaining open to genuine intimacy. This path is not easy or comfortable, but it offers something invaluable: the freedom to be genuinely yourself while still maintaining loving connections with others. It promises not invulnerability to all difficulty, but the psychological resources to meet life's challenges consciously and skillfully. It offers not protection from all pain, but the wisdom to distinguish between necessary growth-oriented discomfort and unnecessary psychological drainage. Jung's vision of human psychological development recognizes that we are all interconnected, that our unconscious patterns influence each other in complex ways, and that true healing occurs not through isolation, but through the development of conscious relationship. When you do your own psychological work, you not only free yourself from draining interactions, but also contribute to the psychological health and consciousness of everyone around you. The ripple effects of this work extend far beyond your immediate relationships. Jung believed that individual psychological development contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. Each person who does the difficult work of integration and individuation helps shift the overall psychological climate toward greater awareness, maturity, and conscious relationship. This understanding transforms the work from a purely personal endeavor into a contribution to the healing and development of humanity as a whole. Your commitment to psychological wholeness becomes not just an act of self-care, but a gift to the collective unconscious, adding your unique contribution to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. The path Jung outlined is demanding and requires consistent commitment over many years. It cannot be rushed or achieved through willpower alone. It requires surrender to psychological processes that unfold in their own time, patience with the inevitable setbacks and resistances that arise, and faith in the ultimate meaningfulness of the journey, even when progress seems slow or unclear. But for those who undertake this journey with sincerity and dedication, it offers the most profound reward possible: the unshakable peace that comes from knowing yourself completely and living authentically from that knowledge. It promises relationships based on conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, creative expression that flows from your unique individual essence, and the deep satisfaction that comes from contributing your authentic gifts to the world. The work begins now, with your willingness to look within and take responsibility for your own psychological patterns. It continues with each moment of conscious choice to respond rather than react, to integrate rather than project, to differentiate rather than merge. It deepens with every step you take toward becoming the unique individual you were meant to be, while maintaining genuine connection with the web of relationships that give life meaning and purpose.